A simple cook became the focal point of a political storm during England's religious Reformation. Richard Roose, a chef accused of poisoning, was boiled alive, despite the investigation into the poisoning remaining unclear. On the grey morning of April 5, 1531, the sky hung heavy over London, as if the very heavens themselves could sense the unspeakable horror about to unfold. A crowd gathered at Smithfield, the usual site for both executions and cattle markets. Yet today, the square would bear witness to a spectacle unlike any other. At its center, an immense bronze cauldron sat atop a roaring fire, the flames crackling as the water within began to heat, its surface shimmering with a cruel promise. A hush fell over the onlookers as guards with grim determination brought forth a man bound in ropes. His name was Richard Roose, a cook in the service of Bishop John Pfizer. The terror on his pale face was unmistakable as he gazed upon the instrument of his impending death. In mere moments, he would face an execution as rare as it was horrific, a death by boiling, in which every inch of his skin would slowly dissolve in the scorching water. But how had a simple cook found himself condemned to such an unimaginable fate? To answer that, we must rewind the clock several weeks and delve into the twisted series of events that led to this grisly day. In February of 1531, England found itself in the throes of one of the most tumultuous chapters in its history. King Henry VIII was resolutely determined to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. This bold and controversial decision tore the kingdom apart. On one side, there were ambitious courtiers who eagerly supported the king's desire to remarry, believing it would bring political and personal advantage. On the other side stood the conservative clerics, deeply committed to the sanctity and indissolubility of marriage, seeing the king's actions as nothing less than a sacrilegious breach of divine law. Among the most vocal and fervent critics of the royal divorce was John Pfizer, the Bishop of Rochester. A man of unwavering religious conviction, Pfizer was one of the staunchest opponents of Henry's divorce, believing it to be a grave injustice. His opposition earned him not only the wrath of Henry VIII himself, but also the enmity of the Boleyn family, who viewed him as a significant obstacle to their ambitions. Living in constant fear for his safety, Bishop Pfizer's life became one of paranoia and heightened vigilance. He took extreme measures to protect himself, changing his sleeping quarters every night to prevent any attempt on his life. He was especially cautious with his food and drink, convinced that someone might try to poison him. And as we will see, his fear was not without reason. His suspicions were about to be tragically vindicated. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. At the episcopal residence in Lambeth, located south of London, Bishop Pfizer employed a staff of servants, one of whom was Richard Roose, the cook. Roose was a man of no particular distinction, an ordinary middle-aged individual who blended seamlessly into the crowd of servants that kept the grand estate running smoothly. He was discreet and efficient, never attracting attention or suspicion, until the fateful day of February 18th. That afternoon, the bishop hosted a meal for some guests, and as was customary, the menu included a thick, hearty soup that was a staple of the English diet at the time. Roose prepared the broth as he always did, but with a sinister twist. Unbeknownst to the diners, he secretly added a powder to the soup. In the years that followed, Roose would claim that he had done so as a jest, thinking the powder was a harmless purgative meant to cause some mild digestive discomfort. Not a deadly poison, a cruel prank, yes, but not intended to kill. The bishop, however, ate little of the soup, not out of suspicion, but perhaps due to a lack of appetite. Other guests, however, consumed more generously. As was the custom, the leftover food was later given to the beggars who had gathered outside the residence, seeking alms. Among them were two humble souls, Bennet Kerwin and Alice Triet, who could hardly believe their luck when they were handed hot food from the bishop's kitchen. Little did they know that seemingly generous act would seal their grim fate. Hours later, the horror began to unfold. Those who had consumed the soup were struck by excruciating abdominal pain, their bodies racked with violent vomiting, cold sweats, and uncontrollable convulsions. Bishop Pfizer, fortunate to have eaten only a small portion, survived the ordeal, having ingested little of the poison. But others were not so lucky. Bennet and Alice, who had eagerly devoured their bowls, paid the ultimate price. The next day, their lifeless bodies were discovered, their twisted forms still locked in the agony of their final moments. As news of the poisoning spread like wildfire, the shockwaves reached the ears of Henry VIII himself. The king, though politically opposed to Bishop Pfizer, was enraged. This act of poisoning, so brazen and vicious, threatened not only the life of an important church figure, but also the very stability of the monarchy. If bishops could be so easily poisoned, how could anyone guarantee the safety of the king? The monarch acted swiftly, ordering an immediate investigation into the incident. Richard Roose, attempting to flee the city, was captured in short order. He was brought to the Tower of London, where he would face the horrors of torture. There, he was subjected to the rack, an infamous method of torment in which the prisoner was bound to an X-shaped structure, his limbs stretched to the brink of breaking. Under the crushing weight of this agony, Roose finally confessed to adding the powder to the soup, but he maintained that he had no idea it was poisonous. In his mind, it was merely a purgative, meant to cause temporary discomfort, not the deadly fate that had befallen his victims. In an unexpected turn, the case did not follow the usual course of legal proceedings. On February 28th, Henry VIII took the highly unusual step of personally appearing before Parliament to report the crime, a rare and extraordinary action for a monarch of that era. The king described the poisoning not only as a heinous attack on Bishop Pfizer, but also as a direct assault on the crown itself, a crime of high treason. Parliament, ever eager to comply with the king's wishes, swiftly passed the Act for Poisoning, 22 Henry VIII, Chapter 9, which classified poisoning as high treason and decreed death by boiling as the specific punishment for such an offense. This is a detail that warrants particular attention. Henry VIII did not wait for a proper trial to determine Richard Roose's guilt. Instead, he took matters into his own hands, swiftly declaring Roose guilty, and even retroactively creating a law to punish him in an exemplary and exceptionally brutal fashion. The traditional penalty for treason was already grotesque. The condemned would be dragged behind horses, hanged nearly to death, castrated, and then quartered alive. But the king desired something far more agonizing. He sought a punishment that mirrored the terror of poisoning itself, a slow, agonizing death where the criminal would feel the progressive heat of the boiling water, his body cooking gradually. But why such cruelty? What compelled the king to involve himself so personally in a case that, while serious, concerned nothing more than a cook and a bishop, one who wasn't even his ally? The reasons behind Henry VIII's actions remain unclear. Some historians suggest that the king harbored a genuine fear of poisoning, considering it the most cowardly form of death, unworthy even for his enemies. Others, however, propose that there were more complex political motivations at play, with the king perhaps attempting to send a message or divert attention from more significant political tensions. Whatever the truth, it was clear that the king's response was driven by a profound need for control and retribution, in a time when the lines between justice and vengeance were often blurred. The imperial ambassador, Eustace Chaput, a close ally of Bishop Pfizer and a staunch supporter of Queen Catherine, suggested in private correspondence that Henry VIII's extreme response to the poisoning was, in part, an attempt to divert suspicion away from himself. Chaput argued that the king's fierce actions were meant to show that he, too noble to resort to such treacherous methods, was far above suspicion, at least in relation to Anne Boleyn and her family. This theory holds some weight. After the poisoning, rumors quickly spread, accusing the Boleyn family of having secretly hired Roose to kill Pfizer, one of the greatest obstacles to Henry's plans to marry Anne. The swift and highly public execution of Roose served a dual purpose. Not only would it act as a brutal example for anyone contemplating similar crimes, but it would also likely put an end to any further investigation that might implicate those closer to the king, especially those in the Boleyn camp. Whether Henry's motives were purely about justice, or whether political maneuvering was at play, one thing was clear. Richard Roose's fate had already been sealed. His execution was set for April 5th. This rare and macabre event drew a crowd to Smithfield. People flocked to the site, eager to witness such an unusual spectacle. Onlookers pushed forward, desperate for a better view. Street vendors wandered through the crowd, peddling food and drink as though the execution were some kind of public theater, rather than the gruesome and tragic end of a human life. The sense of detachment, the casual commodification of death, added another layer of horror to the already disturbing event. The great bronze cauldron was already bubbling ominously by the time Roose was led to the execution site. Some reports suggest he was given a measure of alcohol beforehand, perhaps a final, merciful gesture to dull the inevitable suffering awaiting him. The guards stripped him of his clothes and with grim efficiency lifted him above the cauldron, preparing him for the dreadful fate that awaited. A priest quickly recited a prayer, offering absolution for Roose's sins, though no absolution could ease the agony his body was about to endure. What followed was one of the most horrifying executions ever recorded in English history. Roose was plunged into the boiling water 3 times. On the first immersion, only his legs were submerged. His blood-curdling screams echoed throughout the square as his skin began to peel away from the flesh of his lower limbs. The sheer horror of the sight caused some in the crowd to faint, while others, unable to bear the unimaginable pain on display, turned away. The second dip saw Roose's torso submerged up to his chest. The once clear water turned a sickly pink, tinted with the dissolving remnants of his flesh. His screams, now barely recognizable, became gurgling gasps for air as he struggled to breathe in the scorching water. On the third and final dip, Richard Roose was fully immersed in the cauldron. Death, though a merciful release, came slowly, ending the unimaginable torment that had tortured him for so long. Roose's execution, however, was not a singular event. Thanks to the new law, anyone convicted of poisoning would face the same gruesome punishment. In 1542, a woman named Margaret Davies met a similar fate at Smithfield, boiled alive for allegedly poisoning 3 households where she had worked. This barbaric method of execution remained in place until the reign of Edward VI, Henry VIII's son, when reforms were introduced to curtail the most savage forms of punishment. Yet for those like Roose, it came far too late. What makes Richard Roose's case especially disturbing is not just the sheer brutality of his punishment, but the political context in which it occurred. Roose became an unfortunate victim of a volatile period in England's history, a time when the country was teetering on the edge of monumental religious and political upheaval. John Pfizer, the bishop whom Roose allegedly tried to poison, would not escape his own tragic fate. Just 4 years after the poisoning in 1535, Pfizer was executed for refusing to acknowledge Henry VIII as the supreme head of the Church of England. His severed head was displayed on London Bridge, where it remained until it became little more than a grotesque, unrecognizable mass, only to be replaced by that of Thomas More, another vocal opponent of the king. The political turmoil surrounding this period also affected Anne Boleyn, whose rise to the throne was indirectly tied to the Roose case. In 1536, just 5 years after these events, Anne herself would face execution, charged with adultery, incest, and treason. Accusations widely regarded as fabrications designed to clear the way for Henry to marry his third wife, Jane Seymour. As for Henry VIII, his reign would continue for another 16 years, marked by further marriages, more political machinations, and his definitive break with Rome. In the years that followed, he transformed England into a Protestant nation, yet his paranoia and brutality only intensified with age. His reign left a legacy of bloodshed and cruelty, forever staining English history. The site where Richard Roose met his horrific end is now a bustling commercial center, with no plaque or monument to commemorate the atrocity that occurred there. Few Londoners passing through Smithfield realize that, beneath their feet, a man was once slowly boiled alive in a bronze cauldron, an unsettling chapter of history almost forgotten by time. Roose's story offers a chilling glimpse into a past where justice and cruelty often went hand in hand. It serves as a stark reminder of an era when those in power could rewrite laws to suit their own desires, and when the value of a human life was often determined by the political utility of their death. It is impossible to know with certainty whether Roose was truly guilty, whether he was a scapegoat for a larger conspiracy, or whether he made a tragic mistake by adding an unknown substance to his master's food. What is clear, however, is that his punishment far exceeded any reasonable sense of justice, even by the brutal standards of his time. His execution remains a grim reminder of how power and authority could be wielded in the most extreme and unforgiving ways. Execution by boiling, an agonizing death, that mirrors the very act of cooking. The profession of Richard Roose carries an unsettling irony that cannot be overlooked. A man whose life was spent preparing food in large cauldrons met his own end as an ingredient in one. This punishment was not simply about eliminating the criminal. It was an act of grotesque, poetic vengeance, designed to fulfill the brutal sense of retributive justice prevalent in that savage era. More than 5 centuries have passed since that dreadful April afternoon in Smithfield. The world has changed in ways that Henry VIII and his contemporaries could scarcely have imagined. Modern justice systems, though far from perfect, now emphasize rehabilitation over retribution. Our laws, in theory, are applied equally to both the powerful and the powerless, and even the most heinous crimes no longer warrant punishments that involve deliberate torture. Yet, the haunting story of Richard Roose, the man who was boiled alive, continues to captivate us because it serves as a stark reminder of how fragile the line is between civilization and barbarism. It shows how easily institutions that are meant to protect citizens can be twisted into instruments of terror when manipulated by those in power. Beneath the hurried steps of today's Londoners, the echoes of the past still reverberate. If we listen closely, we might still hear the faint, ghostly screams of a cook, a man who, on a bleak April day in 1531, tragically learned what it means to be on the wrong side of the cauldron.